So next is Ms. Perry. Come up and introduce yourself.
Karen, I do have something to show. Mostly we're just talking, we don't have.
And so there's this microphone that you have to talk into, so just to get to public, out there. So you can move it around.
Yeah. This is our director
Yes.
of English Language Arts, K-12, and she has brought with her one of her esteemed high school English teachers, Justin Barraza. Welcome.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
I don't ever think about showing things because we do words, we don't do, so we may have something for you to see in a minute. The thing that I really wanted to talk about initially was words, and the importance of words and how the whole idea of words and what they mean are part of what we do in English classes from the elementary through the high school. But it's become such a loaded political topic that I decided to shift a little bit to sort of think about what really goes on in English classes. What's the big sort of common sort of process that we carry out in any English class? And I came upon the idea of patterning. I was talking with Matt Coleman about this, and patterning is a huge element of math instruction as well, and we could maybe say that about any subject, because learning is actually about putting things in patterns and seeing how they work. But I thought it'd be interesting for you maybe to hear a little bit about how patterning is something that we use and that we help kids to see as we go through the various things that we do in English classes. So I'm going to start with the idea of literal transference. Now, most of the stuff that we do in English classes, we don't expect to see ideas that we talk about literally transferred to people's lives. We usually deal with ideas that occur in different ways. But recently, we had an interesting example at Audison where the students were reading in the 7th grade, Warriors Don't Cry. It's a book about the Little Rock Nine, and it details the struggles of these kids who didn't try, but they were in the schools and not wanted, and it was really difficult. And at the end of that book, Rachel Grodman, a 7th grade teacher, got a letter from a parent saying that her daughter was not going to be in school for a few days. And the reason was that the family was going to go to Washington, to the March on Washington in January. And she cited the book as the impetus for the family deciding to do it, sort of acting on your principles, standing up for yourself, doing what's important. So that was an interesting and not very common experience, to have something that was read in class actually have an observable result in somebody's life. So it was great for the teacher to know. And it was also, it's one example of how the patterning that you saw people's lives, and this is a nonfiction book, that patterning sort of projected into actual daily life of our students. So that's one place, but as I said, it's not necessarily the most common, nor is it what we're really moving towards. The second area where patterning is really big is in the whole issue of meaning in literature, just meaning in general. I'll give you a couple examples. In Romeo and Juliet, which is a book most of you probably sort of came upon at some point in your life, I know when I came upon it, I couldn't believe that I was so anxious to read this book or this play when I was a kid, and I wanted it to be a love story. So you get into the whole first act. I mean, it's like people fighting, and it's a terrible, terrible story. I was, boys fighting. I was not interested in this book or in this play. It irritated me. And in fact, what goes on in the whole process of this particular piece of literature is we have wars, and we have wars between people. We have destruction. We have nastiness, which is the entire environment. And then in the middle of this, we have two kids who are falling in love. And so what we have is the pattern of how people behave badly, and then what happens when you try to get that germ of love in the middle of that, and how one pattern affects the other. So, without the whole war issue, the tragedy of the love couldn't have happened the way it did. So frequently in the literature that we read, we have one set of patterns, one set of ideas, one set of behaviors which create a kind of universe, and then another set which create another universe. And it's the interplay or the juxtaposition of those two patterns where meaning sort of evolves. So, that's one example. Another example from a book that you guys probably remember from some point in your life is from Mockingbird. And the thing about the patterns in that book are interesting because you've got little kids showing all the innocence of being little kids, and you have a number of characters who show innocence and how lovely it is to be innocent. And if you read that book, often, at least for me, I can remember back to the innocence of just playing around and doing silly things that kids do. That contrasts with the whole issue of ignorance. And a number of the questions that come up here are questions of, if you are innocent, can you be ignorant? What is ignorance? How do those two go together? Is ignorance really lack of learning, or how do those ideas play? So the patterning that you see, the constant set of examples of innocence play against an increasing set of examples of ignorance and bias and prejudice and bad behavior in all sorts of ways. And so neither of those sides without the other would make a lot of sense, or wouldn't make as much sense. So you need both. So we ask kids, we help kids to see how the behaviors and the patterns of behaviors actually work to reinforce each other and to make meaning. And then the transferring of that, I think, to the way people think is that there's the idea that kids begin to look for patterns. They begin to look to see how things fall into line and how things sort of make sense in a kind of order, and what that order is and how that order could shift. So, we could go through every book that we teach, but I won't do that to you. The third area where patterning, where we spend a lot of time on the issue of patterning, is around structure. And in literature, structure is, often structure is part of the meaning. Certainly the best example of that is poetry. In a sonnet, the sonnet makes part of the meaning. In a haiku, the same thing occurs. In a play, you have a certain number of acts, and the acts begin to shape what goes on. You can only do so much, and plays can't be that long, so whatever happens has to happen there. So we begin to talk to kids about how, when you are reading something, the shape of that thing adds meaning. That begins to move into the area of writing. So when you're writing something, the shape that you put it in, how it's formed, that begins to make meaning as well. So kids begin to be conscious of how something goes together, and the way that it goes together is the way that meaning occurs from it. In novels and short stories, the same thing. We have lots of words that you're familiar with. Plot, the main issue of structure, but then there's themes within that, there's subplots, there's all sorts of imaging, all the literary terms that you know. All those things begin to make patterns which make meaning. The final example has to do with sentences. And I wanted to read to you the first sentence from a book by Toni Morrison, which the seniors in the AP class read. And the book is Song of Solomon, and Song of Solomon is an incredible book. It's not an easy book to read, but it keeps giving incredible imagery and ideas, and it just keeps coming back at you. It's not a book you can passively read, but it's a book that every time you put some energy into it, you get a whole bunch more back. So I'm going to read you the first sentence, which is a goofy sentence, and the whole first scene of the book is just and there's a show
off to the side are people standing on chairs. Mr. Conklin is standing on a chair.
I don't need the thing anymore, guys. You don't need to do this. The whole first scene of this of this book is it's a crazy scene. But the first sentence is this. You have it, I think I put it in your notes. The North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance agent promised to fly from Mercy to the other side of Lake Superior at 3 o'clock. Now, that sentence in and of itself may or may not make a lot of sense. When I started this book, I was petrified because I was going to have to teach it. I hadn't read it before, and I thought, oh my, I don't know what this is going to be. And I read the sentence, and it completely demonstrated why I needed to be nervous. So when I did it with kids, we read it out loud a few times, and we tried to figure out what these words could mean. None of these words is difficult. They're all pretty straightforward words. But Toni Morrison actually talks about this, and I want to just read to you how she talks about putting sentences together, and that's why I've sort of included this. She spends a lot of time talking about sentences and how she writes them. So I'm going to read the sentence again and then what she says about her construction of it. The North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance agent promised to fly from Mercy to the other side of Lake Superior at 3 o'clock. This declarative sentence is designed to mock a journalistic style with a minor alteration. It could be the opening of an item in a small-town newspaper. It has the tone of an everyday event of minimal local interest, yet I wanted it to contain important signs and crucial information. The name of the insurance company is that of a well-known Black-owned company dependent on Black clients, and in its corporate name are Life and Mutual. The sentence starts with North Carolina and closes with Lake Superior, geographical locations that suggest a journey from south to north, a direction common for Black immigration and in the literature about it, but which is reversed here since the protagonist has to fly south to mature. Two other words of significance are fly and mercy. Both terms are central to the narrative. Flight as escape or confrontation, mercy, the unspoken wish of the novel's population. Some grant it, some despise it. One makes it the soul cry of her extemporaneous sermon upon the death of her granddaughter. And she goes on. I thought it was good for you to hear this, because the precision that Morrison describes here in her choice of words in this one sentence is the kind of precision that we would hope we could lead students to understand that sentences need to have, or that conversation needs to have. We're in a time right now, and it's making English teaching interesting, where precision in language isn't necessarily something that's as valued, or it's valued differently than I remember it being, or that I would like to think it is. So this takes on, for me, a fairly heavy meaning, because if it's the only thing that we do to help kids understand that the words that they use represent the ideas in their heads, and the ideas in their heads are what they are, that we are all of that, the things that we say and the things that we write are us. It's the only way we get it out of here is to get it out somehow on paper or in words. And being true to that is really key and important. So I thought that would be something interesting for you to know about. In a minute, I'm going to let Justin talk about the new 10th grade course, but I just want to read you one more thing from Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize acceptance speech. She writes about words. Word work is sublime because it's generative. It makes meaning that secures our difference, our human difference, the way in which we are like no other life. We die, that may be the meaning of life, but we do language, that may be the measure of our lives. And I think that's really cool, because the language is what we say, what we think is the measure of our life. So from that to Justin, go.
Thank you. To kind of just follow up on what Ms. Perry was saying, first of all, thank you for having me and entertaining this. It's the new course is actually a product of studying patterns in the classroom and in the ELA classroom, and we're always asking our students, what are you noticing? What are the things that you're noticing? And the 10th graders especially are really focusing on the things that they observe and the patterns that they do notice, and to quote Ian Fleming in Goldfinger. The original quote is, "Once is an event, twice is a coincidence, and 3 times is enemy action." We modify that, obviously, because we're not dealing with enemy action necessarily, but we are in the business of patterns all the time. And so, that's where many of the 10th grade English teachers are starting, right? As opposed to these big questions about what's the theme of Macbeth? Which one? There are so many of them. We're asking the students to discover what the patterns are so that they can make their own meaning with these classical texts. And that is where they start. They're engaging, halfway between this very formal literary lens and this reader response lens of what's exciting, to these students. You've got your language and structural patterns that, like Ms. Perry mentioned, but you also have the tendency to, literally stab your best friends in the back in Macbeth. These are the patterns, there's something for everyone. And so it's moving on these patterns and we're calling this new course Examining Expression because the old course was called Literary Heritage. And midway through the year, as part of MCAS preparation, but also just as a part of the normal preparation in the course over the 10th grade year, we asked the students, okay, so what are you noticing about all of these texts? And recently a student said something along the lines of, everything is about war and life is horrible, which it was hard to argue with that a little bit. And to the point that was raised earlier, some of these texts, which are fabulous, really, really rich texts that are very, very dense and so nuanced and are considered canonical or classical works of literature, some of them were written hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was move away from this idea of this, or expand upon the idea of this is your literary heritage. You're all doomed basically to, not figure out how to communicate effectively, and everyone in your family will perish as a result of your inability to communicate, and kind of open things up a little bit. So we're hoping to turn the corner and really expand and challenge the students to expand their own experience as they identify these patterns into something, where they're looking at all 4 modes of communication that are stressed by the Common Core, for example, but are really, really important in everyday life with reading, writing, speaking, and listening. If most of these characters that they've dealt with already were a little bit better at listening or a little bit better at speaking, everything would have been, I'm not going to say great, much better though. And the students are recognizing this. And so that being said, we're hoping to create an opportunity to change things up and start adding things to the 10th grade curriculum that will encourage students to see a little bit more of themselves in the authors, in the characters, in the protagonists, so that we're not reading things necessarily, again, these wonderful works of literature that are primarily, if not in the 10th grade, mostly all by deceased white men. So we're moving towards this place where a student who does not identify as white can see themselves in the characters, in the authors, while still understanding the patterns that are happening through, what does effective communication look like? And so by even calling the course Examining Expression, we feel really, really positive about the idea that they'll be able to, they'll be expected to, but also be encouraged to and develop the skills to figure out, oh, this is what happens when I don't talk about my feelings appropriately. This is what happens when I don't listen to someone who's really trying to give me, if not good advice, some advice, or someone cares about me. In addition to those skills about reading and writing that we're already working on in terms of, again, looking at those patterns. One of my coworkers, Tim Martin, I distinctly remember in his interview, not exactly what he said, but he mentioned that literature is how we get to examine, something along the lines of literature is how we get to examine the more difficult experiences and decisions and ideas in a safe manner, which is to say, we don't have to deal with the real life ramifications of these things that all of these characters are experiencing, but most of the characters in the 10th grade curriculum are choosing the worst possible thing you could do as a result. And so that's the sort of thing that, in this fast-paced world, in this, I won't say shoot first, but in this tweet first, ask questions later environment that the world really, really embraces now, whether or not we like it, we can still stay rooted in the text, in the literature. No matter what that text looks like, we can look at those patterns and see, okay, it doesn't matter who's doing it. What is being said? What is being claimed? What's the claim here? And we can identify those patterns using the tools and the skills that will allow us to hopefully be less judgmental and communicate way more effectively than we currently do, just kind of as a society and as a world. So we're hoping to, as I said, expand and open up and even maybe this year start piloting at least one new text or a couple of new texts by the end of the year that will offer students who maybe have not seen themselves in literature the chance to do that in a way that they'll be able to really, again, use all 4 of those communication modes to demonstrate both that they are very skilled and talented in the things that they are reading, but also that what they're reading does matter in the real world, which, as Deb mentioned, sometimes it doesn't feel like that. We feel confident that we can help the students understand. You know, obviously, I keep going back to Macbeth because I think it's the stabbiest of all of the the texts that we work with. But a lot of them do, in fact, focus on war and things like that, which hopefully is not the message that we want the students to receive over the course of the 10th grade curriculum. So thank you for listening.
Thanks. Stay there. We're going to have questions and comments. Mr. Hayner.
I have a question and a comment. When you do Shakespeare with them, do you read it in the Middle English?
So
Or is it adapted?
we use Shakespeare's original texts, and at least in my classes, I'm sure in all of the other 10th grade classes, we read what's on the page. We do have access to modern adaptations, and there are things like No Fear Shakespeare and things like that that help them.
My comment is that my 10th grade teacher turned me on by making us read, or read with her from the book orally. Then she brought in, and I'm going to date myself, records from professional actors. I remember Dame Judith Anderson playing Lady Macbeth, and hearing it and seeing it, double modality. You could get it right. We got it right away. And then she would ask us to turn around. Basically, it must have been a woman way before her time, to what's going on in the world right now that is similar.
Sure.
And convert it. I mean, the idea of Shakespeare was so alien to me. After having this teacher, we were all turned on to it and excited about it. And I thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you.
With our kids today.
So I have a general question and comment. How do you see English language arts how has it changed in the last 10 years, and where do you see it going in the next 5 years?
English instruction?
Yes.
Okay.
In 5 words or less. No.
With footnotes.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things that's happened, which is not news to anybody, is that kids, you used to be able to go to the store and you could sort of quietly buy that little book that was the synopsis of whatever it was you were supposed to be reading. Now it's so much easier. You just go click, click, and it's online. So we've had to be a little bit creative about ways that we have to own the fact that that's there. I mean, no sort of threats, nothing's going to stop that from happening. So where it becomes, where we really notice a change is in kids can get, in addition to sort of information about whatever the book is about, but also papers written on any topic that we could come up with. So we've changed the way we do our writing assignments in general, and this actually coincides nicely with what the SAT is doing and with what the MCAS is doing and what PARC is doing, and it's actually much better educationally. We're asking kids to look at a couple of different pieces of text that could be music and a poem. It could be a poem and a piece of like a short story. It could be any number of things, nonfiction, fiction. And then ask them, maybe they're on similar topics or somewhat similar topics, ask them to read that. Come up with some places, patterning again, where there's commonality, and then come with their own idea about what that might be, and then go back to the text and find the evidence. It's the same process that we ask them to do. It's actually much more creative, much more interesting, and it's a little more foolproof in terms of kids not being able to find that thing or, that question online and just copying it. So that's one thing. I think my own, and you can talk in one second.
Yeah.
There's this other thing that's happening to me, and there could be lots of other reasons for that, but I think it's happening to kids also, where attention spans are shorter because of technology, and people can get things so much more quickly and sort of access it, and then get the real synopsis, and then get in and get out. And so helping kids to figure out how to sustain focus on a piece of literature, for instance, or sustain focus on a piece of writing, so that it's not just done. I mean, this is an age-old issue for English teachers, that you give them 2 weeks and they still do it the last minute. So that
I never did that.
issue of how to sort of reinforce that. But paying close attention isn't the same given as it used to be, and I'm not sure it ever was a total given, but it's not as easy, I think.
And I think to kind of expand on that, we're in a place now, and we will continue moving forward into this place where anything and everything can be a text. Evaluating which things should be considered, evaluating sources, whether it's Wikipedia or the sources at the bottom of Wikipedia, which is, I feel like I have this conversation every week with my students. There are different ways to obtain sources. Don't take the easy way out. Whether it is looking at a Twitter feed or, a peer-reviewed journal, figuring out the best way to evaluate, or how to evaluate a text for what it's best for, or what the author does best, or what the argument does best, is really, really important, and becoming increasingly important when there's just so much out there. And on the flip side of that, the creative piece, we strive to have students create something that makes them proud to demonstrate that they learned something, as opposed to just spitting something back out. And I know most of, I believe the 10th grade, the 10th grade, we have a final writing piece, but we also have this creative piece where we ask them to work with characters across different texts. What would that look like? What would it look like if, I think one of the examples last year was if SpongeBob SquarePants were the cast of Macbeth. How would this work? And it's totally bizarre. But sometimes the tiniest, littlest things demonstrate the deepest nuances. It's totally silly. I couldn't name a character other than SpongeBob SquarePants. But when the students come in and are talking about, no, actually, I made this character do this because if you look at this, Act 2, Scene 3, this is something that's really important to this character. And now all of a sudden, these connections between seemingly unrelated texts are really making sense to students. That's the sort of thing that kind of really excites me, and we can get them to this place of understanding, know your audience. Hopefully you're not necessarily going to, here I am at a school committee meeting talking about SpongeBob SquarePants, but hopefully you're not going to be, defending your doctorate talking about SpongeBob SquarePants, but instead, the difference between, thine, thy, thou, thee in Shakespeare's Hamlet or something like that. But knowing your audience and understanding that you can really get creative and demonstrate your really nuanced understanding of a complex text with a Twitter feed, with a fake Twitter feed, something that you just create on paper, or using the Chromebooks. It's a whole spectrum of knowing when and how, not to strike exactly, but how to be surgical in your interpretation, but also your creation to demonstrate I've got it. It doesn't just have to be the answer this question you've got, in three pages or more. It can take many shapes.
Thanks. Dr. Ellison-Ampe.
When you talk about them writing the evidence-based analytical essays, where do they learn how to write that? Are they supposed to have learned that before, or is it in that class they learn and then also produce, or?
It's a constant. It starts a little bit in the elementary. Some of the Lucy Calkins units are about that. So what we're constantly doing, or asking kids to do, is come up with an idea, and then why do you have that idea? What's the evidence for that idea? So it's a claim. Essentially it's a claim and an evidence. So it's the idea of making it in a form of an essay gets more sophisticated as kids get older, but the process of asking kids to sort of look at something or think about something and then have an idea and generate an idea and then figure out why they had that idea. That process is a constant. It's the whole question of writing. I know I'm using up all the time of the night. But the whole issue of writing a formal essay, it has come under a lot of criticism, because the simplest way to teach essay writing is the 5-paragraph essay, which is why it has lived a life much longer than it should have lived. So, you have this formula, you do this, and you have the opening paragraph, you have 3 support paragraphs. At each of those support paragraphs, you have the 3 pieces of evidence, you develop the evidence, last paragraph you get out of it, and it's great, it's fine, the structure's there. But it kills the idea of the fact that ideas don't always fit that form. So it's a way to teach process, it's a way to teach structure, but then pulling the structure away and having kids figure out if an idea needs 5 pieces of evidence, and some of them stronger and some less strong, and how do you organize that, and how does that actually look and shape, they can come up with that, they can make that up. It can be legitimate because it's theirs. So that we're fooling around with ways to have that happen. So we're doing a lot of shorter pieces where kids take an idea and expand it as much as they can to get used to the idea of how do you make an argument. I mean, an argument is something that we do, and, I used to do some correcting of the freshman placement papers for MIT. They just sort of brought a bunch of people in to sort of read these papers that high school seniors who were accepted were doing. And if a kid had a paper that was a 5-paragraph essay, we just put it in the bin. The kid just had to sort of take basic remedial English again. It wasn't a good thing. No one likes that 5-paragraph essay because it limits creativity, and it shows no sense of how really an argument should be formed and how your head works. So to answer your question, we do the process pieces all along, and then we play around with the various forms that those arguments could take.
Can I just interject? I don't know if anybody else noticed it, but it warmed my heart. The 2 of the social studies people behind you went like, claims and evidence. And we have been working a lot as a curriculum team on transferable skills, and that's one of the key transferable skills. So while they're talking about developing those skills in English language arts, we're also developing those skills across all subject areas.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, I'm glad you could come.